So this panel was really envisioned as a way to honor the work of a pioneer in critical animal studies, John Sorenson. He has published extensively on the politics of animal rights, the influence of capitalism, colonialism, globalization, on the status of animals, and the legacy of animal exploitation in Canada. And indeed, his work in developing critical animal studies, what is now an interdisciplinary mainstay of scholar advocacy from a sociological perspective, is probably his most profound impact on the field. John has authored or co-edited several of the very first texts in the field, which are too many to mention here. He's also taught some of the first university modules in critical animal studies. He has served as a mentor to many of us, having carved and legitimized a space for us to think about, teach about, and write about humanity's complicated relationships with other animals. I met John as a very nervous graduate student at a conference he was hosting at Brock University in Ontario several years ago. It was a gathering that would become very formative for myself and others. I was also delighted to have him as a guest on our Vegan Sociology podcast in 2021, where he shared some of his reflections on employing vegan perspectives in academia over the years and where we might find ourselves in the near future. Indeed, he was even developing a new module on vegan sociology. So while he's now retired and that class may not come to pass at Brock, it now appears to be a real possibility of future core programming in our discipline across other universities, something I think many of us would never have dreamed possible when we first started this work. So John's warm personality and encouragement has been absolutely essential to this disciplinary growth, as well as confidence building for the rest of us. And it is this type of community work and compassion for one another that is so important for protecting and growing our small but important field. John has been facing some health difficulties and has had to step back from his work. And in coordination with David Nibert, we decided that this conference would be a wonderful opportunity to celebrate all that John has done for the field, and in bringing together some of the leading scholars on critical animal studies and capitalism, we hope to spotlight some of his scholarly achievements, ensuring that they continue to reach new generations of students and scholars. So I've asked Sarah Calling, a student of John Sanbonmatsu, Richard White, Vasile Stǎnescue, and David Nibert, to reflect on John's work and how it influences their own. And I'll introduce each speaker in turn, but I want to begin by reading a couple of thoughts that Sarat has shared. Sarat has been dealing with poor health and as well, and has not been able to join us today. But they wanted to share with us the impact that he's had on her career. And we'll save time for comments and questions at the end of this panel. So just a few comments from Sarat. Sarat is a writer and activist and critical animal studies scholar. She's the author of several books, including Animal Resistance in the Global Capitalist Era, published by Michigan State University Press in 2021, and Chickpea Runs Away, a children's book that chronicles Chickpea the cow, who lives in an overcrowded barn on a farm and has plans to escape as her friends and family are taken away to an uncertain fate. Sarat works as a program director for the Hornby Island Natural History Center on Hornby Island in British Columbia. So her comments are this: thank you for letting me think of me for the panel discussion in honor of John's meaningful and influential work. Learning about John's illness through David last year was saddening, and I always appreciate immensely the good fortune to work with him at Brock University. John's pioneering of critical animal studies has been so important for my animal rights advocacy journey. John influenced and supported animal resistance in the global capitalist era, and which the book, and my upcoming book on animal resistance, which will be announced this year. And I took an independent studies course with him on that topic. He was a supervisor for my MA on the topic as well, which is published in Italian as a book, and then evolved into my independent research into animal resistance in the global capitalist era. So that's comments from Sarat. Sarat, if you're watching, thank you very much for sharing those comments. I'm sorry that you weren't able to speak yourself. So I will now introduce our first speaker for the panel, John Sanbonmatsu, who's going to be speaking on Rethinking Totality, John Sorenson's materialist social critique of animal oppression. John Sanbonmatsu is an associate professor of philosophy at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, where he teaches courses on ethics, political philosophy, existentialism, and other topics. He's the editor of the book Critical Theory and Animal Liberation, and author of The Postmodern Prince, Critical Theory, Left Strategy, and the Making of a New Political Subject. A critic of cellular or cultivated meat technology, He is a creator and curator of the website www.cleanmeathoax.com. John's opinion writing has appeared in the Christian Science Monitor, Detroit Free Press, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and Huffington Post, among other places. His new book, The Omnivore's Deception, What We Get Wrong About Meat, Animals, and Ourselves, a critique of the myth of humane and sustainable meat, will be published by NYU Press in spring 2025. Very exciting. John, would you like to get us going?
Thank you so much. I want to thank you, Corey and Lucia Lang and others who've been involved in this amazing conference. And I want to apologize to the other presenters that I haven't been able to attend this due to other obligations, but I will be watching the presentations later since they're being recorded, thank goodness. I have a lot to say and probably too much to say. I just want to begin maybe by mentioning the breadth of John Sorenson's concerns. Let me just share my screen briefly. I'm not going to be showing what am I trying to say? Not many PowerPoint slides here, but I do want to do that. So hopefully you are all seeing my slides. So let me just begin by mentioning some of the breadth of John's concerns, and just in the area of animal studies, critical animal studies, not looking at his work in anti-colonial analysis of development studies in Africa. So John has been concerned with, among other things, cognitive ethology and the scientific basis of non-human subjectivity, seeing animals as they are rather than as we see them through the distortive lens of the system, analysis of the ecological crisis grounded in historical materialism and political economy, the sociology of knowledge, a prominent feature of his work, encompasses and critique of intellectuals, particularly in academia, and that includes critique of intellectuals not only in the animal sciences, but even in our own field. Marxism and left politics and the failure of the left, the wider left, to acknowledge animal rights, and finally, an appreciation of the political, social, and existential stakes of the animal system. And one of the things that John shows us is the false dichotomy between their interests and ours. Our freedom, our own freedom, depends upon animal liberation. So in terms of the title of my talk, I kind of want to emphasize the different elements of this rethinking totality, totality being the key word of my presentation, also John's materialism and the social aspect, nature of his critique. Now I want to just begin by showing something here. These are just some headlines recently in the news. This one concerns poultry farms culling, quote unquote, nearly 2 million chickens. Donald Trump accusing Haitians of eating and killing and stealing and eating pets. Tim Walz is hunting. Yoav Gallant in Israel saying that Israel is fighting human animals. The Amazon burning. A church called the Cowboy Church is hosting a rodeo event for children with disabilities, and species extinction. Now, the way the public sees these phenomena is not to see them. It sees them as kind of disaggregated, discrete phenomena. And this is, of course, the problem with a worldview that doesn't see power relations. You have to kind of take a step back in order to see the bigger picture. And that is what I'm going to emphasize in my talk on John's work and its impact on me and others. So John, of course, is one of the leading figures helping to promote what we call an intersectional perspective in CIS, showing us that oppression of non-humans is constitutive of oppression of human groups as well. But I think there is also something more going on in his work than this, insofar as he is interested as well in the wider canvas of historical economic development and the premise of speciesism as a total system. In the German ideology, Marx writes, our conception of history depends on our ability to expound the real process of production, starting out from simple material production of life, and to comprehend the form of social relations connected with and created by civil society. Further, to show it in its action as state, And so, from the starting point to explain the whole mass of different theoretical products and forms of consciousness, religion, philosophy, ethics, and so on, and to trace their origin and growth, by which means the whole thing can be shown in its totality. Stop sharing this. It is one of John's greatest contributions in this connection to provide us the basis of a theory of totality. And although this, I would argue, is only an incipient theory, it is nonetheless implicit in John Sorenson's scholarly approach and work. John describes animal advocacy as a mode of challenging the absolute power that humans hold over other forms of life, unquote, quote unquote. In framing the problem this way, he implicitly summons an image of totality. That is, the specter of a planet-wide system of domination overseen or in any event affected by a unitary subject, that is to say, us, Homo sapiens. Now, without this totality, a kind of a theory or paradigm that makes sense, makes intelligible phenomena, the headlines that I showed a moment ago are simply not graspable by the public or by researchers as phenomena connected to one another. For example, the spread of H5N1 in the poultry industry as a result of the contradictions of the capitalist food system and the legitimation crisis of the state. The constitution of racism and racial identity through animalization and uses of animalization to perpetrate genocide, as is occurring in Gaza. The destruction of the ecological order by capitalism and human supremacism, etc., etc. So all of these phenomena are imbricated and co-constitutive of one another, forming a single unified structure. And what John Sorenson has done in his work, I feel, has been to help us carve out a framework for making these phenomena intelligible. Now, the trajectory of Western Marxism, which John is part of, can be read partly as a waning of the Hegelian conception of totality, and therefore too of its metaphysical guarantees. That is, we are faced not with the dawn of history today, the flight of the owl of Minerva at dusk, but its obliteration through ecocide, technological repression, and neo-fascism. In this connection, one of the challenges we face is epistemic fragmentation from reification, which is a concept, of course, developed by Georg Lukács. Because capitalism, Lukács wrote, is a unified economic structure, it correspondingly generates a unified structure of consciousness. The objective needs of capital require the commodity structure to penetrate society in all its aspects and to remold it in its own image. This causes the structure of reification to sink more deeply, fatefully, and more definitively into the consciousness of man. All domains of knowledge, Lukács wrote, and experience are, quote, subjected to an increasingly formal and standardized treatment. Reification, in short, leads to the destruction of every image of the whole, that is, to the occlusion of the totality of social relations. As a result, Lukács wrote, we become, quote, unable to grasp the meaning of the overall process as it really is, that is to say, the organic unity of phenomena. John Sorenson's work has been to resist reification by restoring the image of this whole, and he has done so using the tools of Marxism without, however, succumbing to a vulgar Marxism. And he's done this by, of course, incorporating feminism, anti-racist, post-colonial, anti-imperialist, anarchistic principles, and so forth. Unlike liberal treatments of speciesism, John defines animal oppression not only as a cultural ethical problem, he writes, but he urges us instead to see the problem in a broader political context, unquote, and as part of capitalist structures that commodify all forms of life. His political project has two components. First, Marxist analysis of capital as a form not merely of economic development, but of social production and reproduction. Why or how social? Well, because power and authority derive not from facts of nature, but relations between persons or subjects. Social enters into John's work in at least three ways. First, the system of speciesism is a system of social relations. Second, these relations are constituted through the structures of capital. And third, the relations which humans impose on non-humans are themselves social relations. That is, we stand in relation to other animals as sovereigns in a relation I have elsewhere termed species right. As John Sorenson writes, humans retain their self-proclaimed greater right to exploit and kill others, but should prevent animals from suffering in the process. Despite some tinkering, this is essentially what all exploiters claim, that their rights predominate and that their forms and methods of exploitation are humane or necessary. It is because of this unacknowledged species right that our relations with other animals are shot through with cruelty, sadism, and bad faith. Domination not only causes immeasurable suffering in the billions causes immeasurable suffering in the billions to non-human beings. It also mutilates and distorts our own characters. John's insistence on the material ground of speciesism distinguishes it from many other treatments of the animal system, even ones purporting to be broadly Marxist in orientation. Significantly, his scholarly work on animals developed only after and in parallel with his empirical research on colonialism and development and empire in the Horn of Africa. John has brought the same commitment to political economy to his understanding of the animal system. Human domination, he writes, has reached its apex under global capitalism, unquote. It cannot be addressed outside of a critique of capitalism, he writes. Animal exploitation for profit, quote, is a fundamental component of a global economic structure. Second, John's work has often taken the form of ideology critique, that is, critique of the discursive and cultural mediations that serve to mystify and legitimate systems of power and domination. Cultural mediations and ideology, such as critique of the academic animal industrial complex, critique of humane meat, anti-vegan propaganda, and so forth. So it's characteristic, I'm saying, that he incorporates these two elements, materialist critique and ideology critique. I might give an example of his superb book, Ape, which is a succinct yet comprehensive overview of our representation of other ape species, in which he combines ethology and natural history with cultural analysis, representations of apes in art, ritual, literature, and so forth. He writes, possessing apes and other exotic animals satisfies our desires for domination. Imprisoning them demonstrates abilities to control nature. Through magical associations, exotic pets make owners feel special, powerful, or imbued with properties of their captives. Gazing at an imprisoned collection of strange creatures, he writes, humans can imagine themselves to be something different, not animals. Here as elsewhere, John carefully situates social phenomena historically and politically in context of a global capitalist world order whose cultural mediations make possible its ceaseless reproduction and consolidation. Analyzing the political economy of the exotic animal trade, for example, he places the extinction of apes in the context of the World Bank's policies following the Asian financial crisis, which removed barriers to palm oil exploitation, leading to the clear-cutting, of course, of rainforests and the endangering of orangutans. I want to mention also that John applies the powerful tools of Marxism and the critical tradition to our own movements in his analysis. Antonio Gramsci, famously quoting Romain Rolland, wrote of the necessity of a pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will. More than many activist intellectual scholars working in animal advocacy, John has consistently, and I would add courageously, eschewed facile answers and naive optimism, calling upon us instead to perceive reality as it is rather than as we might wish it to be. He writes in Thinking the Unthinkable, quote, while the animal rights movement has achieved some progress in terms of changing public opinion and policy, it has failed to reduce the number of animals killed and consumed, failed to create meaningful legislation, and failed to change fundamental attitudes towards animals. While veganism has now been taken up by more people, the total numbers remain infinitesimal, and veganism is mainly seen as a personal lifestyle choice, just one among a variety of options. Facing the massive animal industrial complex, which turns billions upon billions of individual sentient beings into property, mere things, life unworthy of life, animal activists have thus far only progressed in making ethical concerns for animals and veganism into quirky but acceptable personal lifestyle choices. Well, when I read that, I find that sobering, but also a breath of fresh air. So John is very intent to show us how to think not only about animals, but about our movements. He's done a lot of work criticizing consumer veganism and pro-capitalist activism. Some of the other speakers we'll be talking about on this panel. He's very vocal critic of animal welfareism, which he's described as a, quote, sophisticated strategy to divert our attention from pursuing truly compassionate goals and social justice for animals into making people feel good about consuming animal products, quote unquote. He has also criticized the cultural and postmodernist turn in Marxism in France and the US, which has had the effect of blunting the force of materialist analysis, which is to say of Marxist critique of bourgeois political economy. He has thus criticized postmodernist approaches also within animal studies as apolitical and obscurantist. This critique is part of John's potent sociology of knowledge, of intellectual discourses and theories. He insists, and this is something that has been important to me personally, he insists always on the strong normative commitment of our work. Quote, critical animal studies must be directed towards stopping animal exploitation, and we intellectuals working in the field, he writes, quote, must accept our responsibility to other animals. Because we're always already in social relation with other beings, we cannot deny those relations or ignore the moral and political responsibility that comes with representing them. If we have time in the Q&A, I'm happy to give an example of ways in which within even critical animal studies, we find a kind of betrayal on occasion of animal interests. Just to conclude, if you're not familiar with John's work, John Sorenson's work, I urge you to look at his introduction to critical animal studies, Thinking the Unthinkable, which is, to my mind, still the best and most comprehensive short treatment of the subject. It's a kind of invocation to radical action and sociological critique. The subtitle of the book, Thinking the Unthinkable, speaks to what Ernst Bloch termed the principle of hope for dawning of the future, a just society which as yet exists only in germinal form. Modernity is characterized both by barbarism and more hopefully by the unfolding and materialization, however partially, of ideas of social justice and equality. Sexual and racial inequality, John notes, were once unthinkable too, even as normative concepts, and today the truly unthinkable, however, is animal liberation. Without totality, then we cannot perceive lines of strategy or liberation. And I just want to note in passing that this is the problem with the liberal approaches of Peter Singer or the technocratic approaches given us by effective altruists, which end up strengthening the animal system as a whole. John writes that the task of creating a global social justice movement that advocates for other animals as well as humans will not be accomplished by forming partnerships with industries that are based upon the exploitation of animals, as we are seeing, I would note, in the cellular meat lobby. It is from John's implicit conception of totality and his understanding of speciesism as a material, historical, economically based system of absolute power that he construes abolitionism, the negation of the negation, as the only proper ground of our praxis and critique. Quote, it is vitally important, he writes, that a social movement be guided by abolitionist principles. In closing, I just want to quote Gramsci as saying that only the man who wills something strongly can identify the elements necessary to the realization of his will, unquote. That is, reality is itself an open field of possibilities to the activist or movement wishing to change it. What we call reality, Gramsci observed, quote, is a product of the application of human will to the society of things. And knowledge of reality and of the possible cannot be arrived at independently of action and will, since, quote, strong passions are necessary to sharpen the intellect and make intuition more penetrating. It is John Soren's passionate commitment, his lifelong commitment to education and activism that has made possible the revelations we find in his work. He has been a praxis-oriented intellectual throughout his life, whether working in Eritrean relief, to enlighten us about Cold War geopolitics and colonialism, or as it gathers us here today, to found critical animal studies within sociology and to provide a basis for intellectual training and mentorship. I just want to say that personally, Cora, you mentioned the influence of John at a conference, just being able to go to one of his conferences at Brock. And that, I want to say that has also changed me and the way I do my work. I met Karen Davis, for example, at one of John's conferences, one of many connections I made. So John has kind of created a basis for international connections within our movement, both through his publications and personal relationships, his conference organizing and mentorship. We're living in a kind of dying, fractious world, and there are very few of us doing this work. So in that context, especially John's contributions have been enormously consequential. So I want to thank John because my debt to what he's accomplished is immense, and I'm honored to have been able to share just a few thoughts on his work. And thank you, and I'm sorry to go on for so long.
Oh, thank you. That's wonderful. It's really great to get some good deep theory.
So it's a wonderful invitation, but a very stressful one as well, because there's just so many ways. I'm sure the other panelists will agree that this could have actually played out in terms of thinking through the influence that John's had on ourselves and the wider sort of academic critical communities. What I've tried to do, and we'll see how successful this may be, is to kind of group them into particular themes, thinking about these geographies of social and spatial justice. But what's quite nice as well is that I think it will fold in some of the opening comments that Corey made and that's been echoed in John's presentation as well. And again, trying to get that sense of the personal as well as the broader sort of academic contributions and debts that we owe John. So that's the ambition. So I think it's impossible not to acknowledge the debt that many of us have to John in terms of the influence that he's had as an editor, not least, and an author, in terms of opening up new spaces for other scholar activists and indeed other disciplines as well, to really ensure that critical animal studies flourishes with that diversity and spread a sort of difference in terms of that intellectual and activist contributions. So I'm going to be thinking about the chapter in particular that was published in this critical animal studies book that John co-authored, when it came to really thinking about the spatialities, I suppose, of animal abuse and other forms of sort of oppression. But yeah, the enormous kind of impact in terms of marrying the intellectual sort of scholarship with scholar activists and activist communities more generally, I think has been, a wonderful contribution and one that's impossible to underestimate. In terms of a starting point, I think it is so important to recognize the power of the imaginary in all of this, which dictates what is possible and enactable. And I think John's work trying to unpack and expose the myths that surround capitalism and speciesism has been incredibly important. And I love the refrain, or the way in which he sort of captures this in Animal Rights when he talks about this living in the world of illusions. And I think many of us would have experienced this as part of our sort of animal liberation activism. That again, it's not about, it's raising consciousness and awareness. There are these key ideologies that close down or open up possibilities dependent upon where we are. So thinking about the ideological sort of way in which that is caged, as it were, our sort of imaginaries about ourselves, our relationship to others, what I found particularly stimulating is how this is embedded in place and space as a sort of an academic geographer, I suppose, by discipline. So when I looked at some of John's work, it's very both implicit and explicit about the different type of spatialities that are being referenced here as part of trying to understand how and under what sort of basis animals are exploited. So in this quote in Animal Rights again, he talks about the interlocking kind of industries that cage, the transportation arteries that connect these places of animal use, animal violence. And this was a nice sort of way in which this was folded into the question of borders and bordering. So in a wonderful paper about moral panic over fake service animals, we have this very explicit reading of space as a means to contain, to separate, to break down the relationships between human and the other. So space is absolutely fundamental in understanding some of the great sort of human-animal divides that many of us in critical animal studies have dedicated our lives to try and unpack and again bring together.
Oh, Richard,
So
sorry to interrupt. I think your
crisis that
slides
occurs when these borders are ruptured. Again, this is such a very powerful way in which we can think about marshalling our form of activism and our intellectual sort of scholar activist contributions, perhaps. So in the Critical Animal Studies book, then, this was a chapter that I wrote with Simon Springer back in 2018. So here we talked about that the awareness of the constellation of relationships between the social and the spatial. So when we talk about social justice, again, there's a spatial element that is very much captured within this question. So geographies in this way, again, when we're thinking about bordering and caging, they're not just sort of incidental backgrounds. They're something that's deeply embedded and interlocking and overlapping with the question of the animal use, which in turn requires a specificity, I suppose, of understanding and context if we are to be able to address those successfully. And all of these sort of thoughts, so this sort of percolated with this particular chapter under John's sort of steady hand and guidance. And within my own discipline, we had Critical Animal Geographies that was published around sort of 2020. And then 2 years later, Vegan Geographies, Spaces Beyond Violence, Ethics Beyond Speciesism, made its appearance. And again, rooted for me in many ways with some of the work that John has put forward.
Richard.
So again, here we can look at the question of space and scale and think about the diversity of difference that these, again, bring forward these very sort of careful and critical questions. Of course, in many ways, this is quite intuitive when we're thinking about perhaps an ethics of care and we're thinking about the distance, the geographical kind of proximities. At what point, as this sort of cartoon illustration asks us, do we stop caring? Is it a case of, being out of sight, out of mind? And when we think about the spatial positioning of things like abattoirs and slaughterhouses, again, we can clearly see how this is used to close down questions, close down people to think about, the violence, the relationships that take place within them. And John's work has been, again, it's wonderful to sort of see this ongoing constant refrains and reminders that animal liberation is never just about the other animal. It's about, the animals are very much inclusive of the human and the human sort of problems and concerns that we have and the way in which that influences our own approaches here. And certainly this has been instrumental for me thinking about emancipatory sort of space and politics of total liberation. And when it comes to actually focusing on questions of animal and animal use, when we're thinking about, literally the slaughterhouse, the house of slaughter, and when the question of, well, who gets to work here has been put forward, again, this is something that is a deeply inconvenient truth for many who would like to use the refrain, well, let's just, solve the human problems first, and then we'll focus on the other animals. But again, the intersection of abuse and violence, the way in which it's captured in the social sort of questions and the spatial ones, and the way in which this is configured within the slaughterhouse and slaughterhouse workers, when these questions are asked, of course, we see that it's the most marginalized, most exploited and disenfranchised populations that are contained within the slaughterhouse. We look at the emerging body of evidence around the psychological trauma So again, it's not just the physicality and the injuries that are found on like the kill line, but again, it's looking at these human, right sort of perspectives as well, and the wider implications on communities and negative coping strategies and so on. So thinking about the question of a total liberation, thinking about humans and animals and the question of space, John's interventions and the way in which he very much brings to the foreground of our focus of attention about the activists, they again put themselves in highly sort of dangerous and vulnerable positions, but are absolutely vital to bringing forward the careful, the non-violent worlds, trying to evolve society in these directions towards, as John termed it, a more compassionate and just society. And it's really encouraging, particularly in our contemporary neoliberal academies, that there is an emphasis on the diversity of strategies and tactics, and the support again that John has articulated, I think, has been incredibly important in this context.
Richard,
but of course, we can see when it comes to thinking about the questions of animal-based activism, liberation movements, if we just highlight one example about going into these hidden private spaces of abuse, there's such an investment to render distinct and separate, never the twain shall meet, between the worlds of production and the worlds of consumption. And part of the power of activism is about rupturing these borders, rupturing these sort of cages that separate the two, and trying to bring these worlds together to raise consciousness and awareness for this public kind of audience. And again, the power that has when it comes to the backlash, the repression, and this, is something that, again, as John has taken very seriously in his work and the reflections that he has. And as we all know, it comes from so many different sources. The power of the lobbying of the meat and dairy industry, the co-option of the government, and the role of the sort of police, questions about the media. Again, all of these are key sort of forces and power sort of structures that we need to begin to wrestle successfully if we are going to begin to make the difference that we all wish to see. But in turn, obviously, to raise these questions, it opens up further space and discussion, and to try and inject them with some, the authentic voices and experiences that, again, marry this line between the academic, the scholarship, and the activism. And so there's numerous publications that have come out in subsequent years that have really tried to take this forward in key radical kind of directions. And I just thought I'd when in that quote there, when John mentions about the media, so there was the Royal Geographical Society 2022. We had our first vegan Geographies meeting. It was probably attended by 5.5 people. I think it was on a Friday afternoon, which again reflects on our own sort of disciplines and the level of interest. But the Daily Mail, or the Daily Mail didn't disappoint. So again, for those that are not aware of the Daily Mail, it's quite a right-wing publication media, and again, they were talking about geographers going woke and tackle subjects such as fulfilling the radical potential and promise of vegan geographies. So again, we're probably doing something right, I think, if we're attracting these sort of headlines. So in terms of the future and the question of sharing spaces more justly, I mean, I think this is something that's deeply embedded in all of John's work. It's that the potential of a better future. The work is always hopeful. It takes us to dark and challenging places, but it does so for a particular reason, which is to bring forward, I think, new imaginaries, particularly around post-capitalist, post-speciesist world, to really inviting us to think about what that might look like, and then to work out from where we are now, how can we create these new social and spatial imaginaries of, living more justly and interspecies sort of context into being. So the challenges, we've mentioned some about the obvious ones and the repression of sort of dominant conservative elements. But it's also, I think, important, and John very much makes this explicit about thinking about academia and scholarly kind of the grounds upon which we stand on as also an activist space. You know, we've all had that sort of disappointing exchange with somebody that is otherwise very radical and critical and progressive. As soon as you mention the animal question, again, everything sort of changes. The demeanor, it's hostile. It's you know, it's again very disappointing. So to try and think through that, but again, how do we intervene and in a way that is a difference that kind of makes all the difference? So it's wonderful things like the conferences, as you say, bringing the international sort of connections and relationships together, both professional and personal. I think you know, is absolutely vitally important. Again, it's such a time of precarity and uncertainty. The final comment that I just want to make, and it's got its own little slide here. So we're just going to do a bit of time traveling back to 2012. So I stepped down from a few years being the editor of the Journal for Critical Animal Studies, and John had been approached to take over the editorship, and we had a collective that was in place at the time. I read this after the event. I had nothing to do with the wording of this, and it was just absolutely wonderful, I think, to think about what we as humans, as fellow earthlings, sort of bring to this. And you can be inspired by somebody's work, but the difference that they make as an individual, as a person, how they sort of embody all that is good and all that is you know, gracious and sort of humble about their sort of contributions on the sort of everyday scales, I think is just, you know, it can be tremendously powerful. So in this reflection, to talk about John merging the academic animal activism, academic research, that commitment to intersectional evolutionary analysis. But again, it's the qualities of kindness and thoughtfulness and respectfulness that, again, I think is something that, you know, we all can take a lot of value for and are inspired by these individuals in our particular lives, for those that are fortunate to know them. So yeah, on a personal level, on a professional, on a, you know, so many different levels, I, you know, owe a great deal of gratitude and thankfulness to John and his work and him himself.
Richard, did you have us muted? Can you hear me?
Before I begin, I just want to take a second to acknowledge what a unique honor it is to be on this panel. Richard published my first peer-reviewed publication ever, and then invited me to be part of the collective for the journal. And just as a side, has a character and a commitment to veganism that just has inspired me for the last 20 years. John published my first article in an edited volume ever. And as you know, has a new book coming out that I had a privilege of reading. And we've worked together to combat lab-grown meat for, I don't know, 10 years now. David published my first article critiquing capitalism ever, and is, of course, just an icon in the critique of speciesism and capitalism. And John Sorenson invited me to one of my first conferences ever as an undergraduate. And that experience of a radical space for animals and a radical space against capitalism set me on my path. So this panel is a panel of friends and mentors, and has shaped the entire trajectory of my life's work to try to make a difference in animals and speciesism. And basically what I'm trying to say is everything that I've done is their fault. John Sorenson and Veganism Beyond Capitalism and Consumerism. John Sorenson is a pathbreaker in the field of critical animal studies. In particular, he is one of the first and most respected voices to speak out against both capitalism and consumerism as means for achieving animal liberation. For example, Peter Singer and Gary Francione are often seen as two poles of the animal liberation movement, with Singer representing a welfarist position of utilitarian harm reduction, and Francione representing an absolute view of complete veganism. However, what they both agree on is the acceptance of capitalism and consumerism as effective means for achieving animal liberation. In contrast, John Sorenson has long argued that animal liberation and capitalism are inherently opposed worldviews. As John phrases it in About Canada, Animal Rights, quote, capitalism involves exploitation of animals as well as humans, and the profit motive extends suffering to a broader scale. Billions of animals are killed each year in food, vivisection, fashion, hunting, and entertainment industries. Mistreatment of animals is shaped by systems of oppression that develop over time to maintain profit, privilege, and power. Or again, as he argued in Constructing Eco-Terrorism, Capitalism, Speciesism, and Animal Rights, quote, emphasizing compassion and concern for others, the animal right movement challenges capitalism's fundamental value, individualism, self-interest, and competition. Or likewise, although capitalism denigrates compassion and concern, insisting that we are motivated only by self-interest, compassion for others is a fundamental part of human nature. There is, I think, important intellectual work happening in each of these quotations. On the one hand, what John does is elevate the ethics of care, first valorized by such feminist thinkers as Josephine Donovan and Carol Adams, and then explicitly contrast these views with the dictates of capitalism. As such, John Sorenson makes care itself a radical anti-capitalist idea, and solidarity and unity as essence of human nature, as the revolutionary practices that we need. Or again, as John argues in About Canada Animal Rights, in my favorite line of his writing at all, quote, for accusations of sentimentalism, we should recall novelist Brigitte Brovie's observation, whenever people say, you mustn't be sentimental, you should take it that they're about to do something cruel. And if they say, we must be realistic, they mean they're going to make money out of it. Moreover, not only does John critique capitalism, he also critiques consumerism as an effective means for animal liberation. Again, as he writes, quote, the concept of the animal industrial complex allows us to understand that animal rights are not simply concerned with what are disparagingly termed lifestyle or consumers' choices. Rather, rejecting the idea that non-humans are commodities, let us break free from the spell of consumerism and recognize that alienation and oppression underlie all capitalist consumption. In fact, I think this insight, this critique of consumerism as a liberatory praxis, might be John's most significant intellectual contribution of all. Allow me to give a personal example of why I find such insights to be so important. When all the hype around plant-based foods first started in the vegan community, it actually convinced me for a while that this might be a way forward for the movement. I even went to KFC for the first time in forever when they came out with their plant-based chicken. However, I went inside and spent a while not just ordering the food, but also sitting down and seeing what I was actually supporting with my money. All the women were Black women. All the workers were Black women. They had brought their kids to the restaurant because they lacked adequate childcare. The children were sitting in the booths in the restaurant, and their mothers would walk around and tell them to keep quiet so they didn't bother the consumers. At lunchtime, the children ordered pizza, which they delivered to the KFC because they were so tired of eating chicken all the time. Nothing, not one thing about this was vegan. Nothing, not one thing about this is what I believe in or I've ever fought. KFC plant-based faux chicken tasted salty and greasy and a lot like failure. But this failure is exactly what John Sorenson already foresaw and critiqued before the hyper-focus on consumerism as a liberation strategy. All forms of consumption, even plant-based one, are, as Sorenson argues, inherently supportive of both alienation and oppression. Moreover, as John anticipated, a system based on consumerism is not only inherently unethical, it simply also will not work. Here is how David Gibbs, the CEO of Yum, the parent company of KFC, described the launch of Beyond Chicken in Yum's annual earnings call. Quote, Beyond Fried Chicken elevated the brand and boosted relevance, resulting in more media impressions than any other product launch in the brand's history. And then, after fanfare, free publicity, public praise, including by many vegans, KFC quietly discontinued its Beyond Chicken. So what, other than providing KFC with the most positive media attention the company has ever received, did any of that actually accomplish? It helped Yum, which made more money. Indeed, they made record profits. It helped Beyond Meat, which posted record stock prices. So many people made money. But how did that help any animal, including humans? Nor is KFC or Beyond Meat alone in this phenomenon. Tim Hortons in Canada has already ended all sales of Beyond Meat because of slow sales. Burger King, after an initial surge, is now experiencing declining sales of its Impossible Whopper. Hardee's in the United States has already added in and then discontinued its plant-based burger. Dunkin' Donuts has already added in and removed its vegan sausage because of declining sales, as has Little Caesars Pizza. Companies introduce new niche food items all the time to generate buzz and to increase interest. It may make sense for some short-term profit for the companies involved. It might make free positive press and attention. They may even keep the products once sales decline. However, as John first argued, such marketing changes do not represent any progress for animals or for animal liberation. It is instead, as John first suggested, just a way to make more money. In contrast to either consumerism or capitalism, John has long argued for veganism to be rethought as a social justice movement in solidarity with other social justice movements. Again, as John phrases it, quote, rather than being a single issue campaign, the animal rights movement and its academic correlate, critical animal studies, addresses the animal industrial complex in its various forms. This approach recognizes that these issues are interrelated and they intersect with human exploitation. Or again, as he phrases it, quote, mobilization for animal rights is a serious social justice movement, sharing fundamental elements of other progressive political movements. A sense of compassion and fairness, a focus on power relations and a critique of domination, inequality, and hierarchy, along with efforts to alleviate conditions for exploitation. Historically, animal advocates have also struggled for human rights. As John argues, veganism is not a diet. Veganism is a social justice movement based on the idea that one cannot own someone else, that consent always matters, that all animals, including humans, matter for their own reasons and not because they can be used for the pleasure of another group. If we keep telling people what we want is health, we will get healthier meat options. If we tell people what we want is animal liberation, maybe we will start to actually get animal liberation. And building explicitly on these arguments, John has suggested that we must support a series of political demands around the environment, animal rights, and intersectional social justice issues. For example, Nation Rising is currently fighting to stop the host of ways that the government directly financially supports meat and dairy. How can an economic boycott of animal agriculture ever succeed, since the government literally just bells out the affected industry dollar for dollar? Let's put a call that animals have the right to sexual consent, the right to refuse sexual partners they do not want on ballot initiatives and parliaments throughout the world. That one right, if enacted, would virtually end all forms of animal agriculture overnight. Let the meat industry run ads to explain to consumers that sexual violence is essential for the industry to be able to run at all. To end where we first began, at this moment and at this conference, let us focus on John's most important intellectual contribution, the fundamental argument that animal liberation and capitalism are inherently incompatible, inherently opposed systems of viewing life. It is here that John has made the most impact on my own life. It is here, more than any other area, that he has had the most impact on the movement. It is here that he has most stood out from the other so-called thought leaders of the animal liberation movement. From the cap in capitalism, referring to the head of cattle, to Henry Ford studying the disassembly plant of the Chicago slaughterhouse to invent the new assembly line of mechanized production, to the forgotten history of the support of cheap meat as a way to buy off the working class, capitalism and speciesism have always constituted interrelated and co-constitutive phenomenon. On a deeper level, the argument that animal liberation is that all animals, including humans, are more than a mere product or resource that can be simply bought or sold. There's a popular meme that one cannot be a meat-eating environmentalist. This is true. However, what John has long argued is that one cannot be a capitalist vegan. Viewing veganism as only a diet, focusing on ever new consumers' options, voting with our dollars, depoliticizing our movement, working with factory farms, supporting humane meat. We're staying resolutely single-focused, limiting ourselves to options that are seen as realistic. That is how we lose. Indeed, that is why we are losing. However, we should simply listen and believe the argument that John Sorenson has steadily been making for over decades, that veganism is a social justice movement, that we should build in solidarity with other social justice movements and working together enact widespread political demands, including a rejection of capitalism and consumerism. That is how we win. This is John Sorenson's enduring legacy to critical animal studies, to animal liberation, to my own research, to our collective research, and to the difference we're trying to make in the world. And I could not be more grateful for his friendship, mentorship, and courageous intellectual vision. The simple truth is it's long since time for the animal liberation to simply listen to what John Sorenson has long been arguing.
Yeah, so I want to say that it's an honor for me to just speak briefly to recognize the work of my friend John Sorenson, who's really a champion for justice and in particular trans-species justice. And a lot of John's work that has impressed me is how he's challenged these oppressive and propaganda-like representations of devalued others and challenging distortions of history. And in John's own words in a 2016 interview, in general, I'm interested in how things get talked about, discourse, images, representations, propaganda. And just to say, there's several interviews with John on YouTube, and I encourage everyone to check those out. You know, a good deal of John's work, especially in the 90s, is focused on the racism war and the oppression and imperialism in Africa and the diaspora. And he's written fairly extensively about that. In 1993, he wrote a book, Imagining Ethiopia, again, challenging representations and historical accounts of what was happening there. In 1994, he co-edited a powerful volume, again, critical of the colonization, imperialism, and then consequent efforts to deal with refugees, which, as was noted in a wonderful review, tend to be top-down solutions that are very inadequate and end up being, in many ways, oppressive themselves. And then in 2001, I believe, we have this great collaboration, John working with Asuko Matsuoka, and again, looking at the imperialism and diaspora as experienced in many cases by refugees in Canada. So throughout this brief presentation, I just want to note that there's a lot of collaboration between John and Asuko, a professor of social work at York. And I think both she and John push the boundaries of their professions and their pushes for justice for all. In 2008, John, he co-wrote this book that was challenging social scientists, especially those who were teaching and writing and professing to try to be objective. Again, challenging this point of view from a critical perspective. And then, of course, 3 chapters in this volume are critical of human oppression of other animals and challenging tropes. And
Sorry, David, I don't think we can see your slides yet.
can you see the slides?
I don't think they're changing. Would you be able to just see if you can click through them on the PowerPoint window? Oh, there we go. You might have to change them however you just did for it to move.
Okay. Can you see this?
Yes. Thank you.
If I may jump in, David, what you need to do is go to slideshow at the top of the menu and then say from beginning. And then that will give you a full screen. You see
Okay,
where
is
it
this
says,
working then?
no. Do you see slideshow? You got to click on at the top menu where it says slideshow. Yeah,
Right.
click
And I
on
go,
that. Yeah, no, click on that, and then it should prompt you. I don't see it prompting you to go to full screen. Well, anyway, we can read it as it is. Never mind.
okay, so I may have to do it like this. Does this work?
Yes.
Okay, and John's book Ape is showing up now.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, I'm sorry for this. So as John just mentioned here a few minutes ago, this was a remarkable piece of work in 2009 in which John does this historical and cross-cultural look at the representations of the other apes, and it got terrific reviews. And of course, what John does here is he does in all of his work. He's pushing for, as John Sanbonmatsu emphasized, the bigger picture, the totality. And again, John was very keen at trying to reach, I think, the broader public, and so he added to this About Canada series in this unflinching look at the terrible oppressive practices of other animals in Canada. And again, once again, pushing for readers, to understand the totality and the bigger picture of what's happening here. 2014, again, here's John and Asuko working with Anthony and Kim in one of the first critical animal anthologies that lays out the philosophy and history of this emerging field. And I'm sorry that I can't get my slides to work properly. Some of the text will be covered here, I'm afraid. That same year, 2014, John is already pushing the boundaries and trying to broaden the understanding of critical animal studies. And as John mentioned a few minutes ago, the introduction here is just profound, that John incorporates, again, pushing the boundaries, again, trying to get scholars and the public everywhere to think the unthinkable. 2016, I'm not sure how John does this, but he came up with this masterpiece in which he looks at these the representations of other animals and of the people working on their behalf, and how industry and their lieutenants in the government, have gone all out in trying to represent scholar activists as terrorists and as akin to Al-Qaeda. And John just provides example after example after example of these bizarre and terribly unjust ways in which, and numerous ways in which, and events in which other animals, activists for other animals have been ridiculed and prosecuted. In 2018, another great anthology, again by Asuko and John. Again, they're pressing the boundaries. They're trying to broaden critical animal studies by including a diversity of voices, looking at the contributors from around the world. And then also in this volume, they also push the boundaries a bit more by asking readers to think and reflect upon what they're reading and to ponder how they can work this into their own efforts for trans-species justice. Get a powerful volume. 2019, John Inosuko, again, very powerful anthology. And I think I heard John say in an interview that he was teaching a course at Brock and looking at dogs and coyotes and wolves and foxes, and he couldn't find a good book to use. So he and Inosuko created one. Again, very compelling, and again pushing for people to see the totality and to see how the awful oppression of these animals and all animals and human animals are all connected. And then John, looking at a few of the chapters that John has written, John keen on getting his work before a broader audience. So contributing to this volume and this chapter on marine land, which and that oppression that continues, as we saw just a few minutes ago by Gillian Walters' presentation. But John takes the opportunity here once again, to look at the bigger picture and to say we can look at animals at marine land, but we can look at all the oppressive, exploitive uses of other animals, and how it is all unjust. And we should be thinking the unthinkable and moving toward an abolitionist world that is necessary for the liberation of all human animals as well. And again, this is John Sanbonmatsu's classic volume from 2011 with the artwork of the renowned Sue Ko. I think that particular piece is called Factory Farms. And again, it is, as John mentioned a few minutes ago, John was had a deep, profound, but still scathing critique of those on the right and those on the left for their unwillingness, to embrace these powerful arguments promoting liberation for all. 2014, again, another powerful chapter by John in this anthology, looking at animals as vehicles and instruments of war. And if you're interested, John does a lecture you can see on YouTube, I think, filmed in 2014, in which you can see him actually talk about this. I encourage everybody to watch that. 2021, John Inosuko, they write this tremendous chapter appearing in this album, this volume by Cazal and Almirón, looking at animalization, and animalization again being just a powerful weapon of oppression, of ideological oppression of humans and other animals. And of course, they connect that to contemporary events, including those of Donald Trump. And just as a footnote, I'm speaking to you now from Springfield, Ohio, where Donald Trump, spread these hateful lies about the Haitian immigrants eating people's dogs and cats that disrupted the city and shut down the university here for a week. But the animalization and the oppressive tropes continue. And again, John has penned so many articles. Again, it's just to look at a couple. He took the advantage of when there was some public attention directed toward maybe slightly changing anti-cruelty laws in Canada to make them slightly more modestly more severe. But again, John notes that they're really doing nothing at all of any substance, but but he's especially interested in showing how the industry has fought viciously in order to try to refute these very modest changes, and then representing animal activists and scholars as, again, extremists and terrorists. Again, John and Asuko in this very interesting article looking at this moral panic over fake service animals, in which they bring into light the continued model of people with disabilities based on this old traditional deficit model, tying ableism and speciesism and classism into this analysis of this hype that has done a disservice to people with disabilities and those animals that have been positioned as service animals to assist them. And again, here's John and Asuko, 2023, again, trying to facilitate the expansion of services for victims of domestic violence and other forms of violence against women, and trying to facilitate, again, pushing the boundaries of social work and sociology, trying to facilitate the expansion of services to include the women's and other victims' relationship with their animals, and fear of what will happen to their animals if they were to leave them behind. Again, so many articles by John and Asuko, too many to talk about one presentation. And then, of course, John, he's also he's reached the public by doing book reviews, and in this case, this rather fearless and scathing critique of this book by one of the leading intellectuals of the movement amongst very conservative evangelicals in the Christian nationalist movement. Again, looking at the self-serving and ludicrous claims put forward by Christian nationalists. And of course, they are speciesist, ableist, sexist, militarist. And John was fearless in his critique. 2012, when there was a bit of a buzz about these two films, Project Nim and I think Rise of the Planet of the Apes. And again, John took the opportunity to review those films, again, noting that they were moving people to think about the continued use and exploitation of the chimpanzees. But then, of course, John pushes the bigger picture, and it challenges readers to think about all forms of oppression of other animals. John has done some amazing interviews, and one of my particular favorites was his interview with Ronnie Lee, again introducing, I think, a new generation of readers to the work of this icon working for justice for other animals, and getting Ronnie Lee to talk in biographical terms and about how he came to form his ideas and who impressed him, and about his 2 prison sentences that he was given for his work on working for animal liberation, and then how he's evolved in his contemporary thinking about the need to combine direct action with public education. And speaking of public education, John's also so prolific. Again, as a public sociologist, always looking for opportunities to get issues of the entangled oppression of human and other animals out before the public. And as there's a buzz about refugees, John, again, is very adept at seizing the opportunity to also talk about other animals as refugees. And as when there was some buzz about the finding the flesh of horses in and packages ostensibly selling the flesh of cows. John, took advantage of that story to basically once again denounce all forms of consumption of other animals. And then John's work has been recognized globally. In 2019, he was invited to give a public lecture in Indonesia, and he was given an award there to recognize his contribution for trans-species justice. And then at Brock, John's work at Brock, from the 1990s, being a powerful force in the sociology department, moving and pushing toward this critical sociology, pushing for the concentration in the sociology department of this critical animal studies concentration, one of the first in Canada. Promoting classes in anti-racism and critiques of capitalist globalization, creating a master's program in critical sociology. And I've directed more than one of my students who were looking to continue their education, trying to point them to Brock. And then in John's words, what they do at Brock is obviously they put the oppression of other animals in the context of all social justice issues. But John was also interested in introducing his students to other activists and scholars. And one of the ways that he did this was to begin these conferences at Brock, which was absolutely brilliant, bringing in scholars and activists and students. And you may have noticed that the background here, this is actually the pond inlet at Brock. And this is the conference room at the pond inlet. And this became one of my favorite places on the planet, because whenever I was at one of these conferences in Brock, it was one of the only times I felt truly at home and comfortable to be around crowds of critical animal studies scholars and activists. And these windows in the back on the right of this picture, of course, is the podium and the screen, but all along this back glass wall were all of these tables, if you can imagine. Students organizations, sanctuaries, various animal rights organizations. It was just, it was kind of like my version of what it would be like to be in heaven. So these conferences, I think these are also, of all the things that John has done to promote critical animal studies and to build this movement, as John and Vasile have mentioned. That's where I first met so many incredible people like John Sanbonmatsu and Vasile, and of course the amazing Karen Davis I met at Brock at these conferences. And again, all the networking and the relationships that were formed was just, I think it's just has been such a major push, for the whole field of critical animal studies and trans-species justice. And it wasn't easy for John to do these conferences. I remember, I think one of the first conferences I attended, John was somewhat worried that they were going to be able to carry off the conference, because the buzz at Brock University was the campus was going to be invaded by an army of animal rights extremists and terrorists. But John, he pulled it off brilliantly. And I think at the second conference I attended, John was again at odds with the university, because they required him at the lunches that would be served, that those be that the contractual food provider at Brock provide those vegan lunches, and John sidestepped that. And he had the vegan lunches catered, and he dealt with the implications of that afterward. But I think over the years, they realized at Brock that this was actually a boon for the university and a boon for their community. And John's work at Brock, his classes and his influence, across the country, around the world, is is absolutely profound. Even there around Brock and St. Catharines, Canada, you can see the influence of John and Isuko, and I think there's as many vegan restaurants there as there are in New York. So, and these conferences that John created, as Corey mentioned, she attended one of these, and I'm sure that that John's conferences has inspired, the wonderful event that we're participating in at this moment. So anyway, it's just my way of wanting to thank John and Isuko for all of their enormous contribution. They're both true champions of justice. They're both leaders in their fields, pushing the boundaries, trying to get scholars and activists in the public to think the unthinkable. And I'm just, I can't wait to see what they come up with next. So John and Isuko, thank you so much.